Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Tech Espresso, where we serve quick, insightful, and engaging tech discussions. I'm your host, Veer Varma, and in today's episode, we'll dive into one of the most urgent and complex challenges in today's time, governing AI responsibly. Joining me today is Dr. Mark Esposito, a geostrategist and Harvard social scientist building the nexus between tech policies and AI governance. He is a professor of economics and public policy at Holt International Business School, where he leads the Future Impact Lab. He's authored over 150 publications and 13 books, including bestsellers like The AI Republic and Understanding How the Future Unfolds. He's a globally recognized thought leader at the intersection of AI, policy, and ethics. If you've wondered how students like us can prepare for an AI-driven future or how we can help shape it, this conversation is for you. Let's get right into it. Hello, everyone. I'm here today with Dr. Mark Esposito, and today we'll be talking about what responsible AI governance really looks like, how governments and industries can work together to build ethical AI systems, and how students can prepare for an AI-driven future. So thank you very much, Dr. Esposito, for coming. It's a pleasure to have you. And let's start with the big picture. So today we hear terms like ethical AI and responsible governance thrown around a lot. They show up in headlines, conference panels, and policy papers. But for many of us, especially students like myself, who aren't in those rooms, these phrases can feel very vague or idealistic. So Dr.
hmm
Esposito, in your view, what does responsible AI governance look like? And what are some of the biggest challenges that we're facing in achieving that at a global level? And also, how do you see technology like blockchain helping us build more transparent or accountable governance systems?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on this podcast here. I appreciate you extending an invitation to me, and happy to go through this quite important topic, right, together with you and your audience. Okay, let's start from the first part. If I remember correctly, you talk about ethical AI, right? Ethical government ethical AI. So look, I think there is a desire today that is justified by the amount of AI that we have in our life, to try to regulate it enough to the point that there is a reflection between the values of a given entity, an organization, a society, right? A country, if you want to take it to that level, with the use of AI. And we like that use to be responsible. So this is kind of where it all starts. Is like the clear awareness that this is an extremely powerful and disruptive set of technologies. It is now quite clear that AI has an implication that could transform organizations, industries, but entire countries. And I think there's a desire for that process to be following some form of ethical standards. Where the tension is coming from is the fact that this technology have been developed by the private sector. So they are technology that are justified have as so like improving the efficiency of what companies do. The implications of these technologies are bigger than just efficiency. And so either stakeholders, citizens, communities, users, we feel that there is I think, a necessity for this conversation to be a little bit more controlled by what we would define to be a safeguard of some sort. And that's to give you a bit in a nutshell where the conversation on ethical AI has started. It is not a conversation that is easily understood by everybody in the same way, simply because if I say that we have ethical standards, we also implies that our ethical standards are deterministic to the communities that they express these needs of standards. And so likely on a global level, we might see different applications of the same question rather than having the same application distributed across. So that's to give you a bit of context on your first question.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I think for our generation, growing up around digital systems, we've always like come to expect transparency, whether it's from platforms, institutions, or the algorithms behind making it, behind them. But
hmm
expecting something and actually like building it into our system are two very different things. And from my point of view, AI is moving so fast that without governance frameworks in place, we risk losing control outcomes. And especially when it comes to bias or decision making in high stake environments like healthcare or finance, that's it's really important. And that's why I've been really
Hmm.
interested in how blockchain might serve as a kind of infrastructure for accountability. And not just to
Hmm.
track what decisions are made, but to ensure that there's a record for why those decisions were made. And it feels like we need both speed and structure. And right now, we're still figuring out how to balance both of them. So,
Hmm.
if you would like to answer the second part of the question,
Yeah,
I, yeah.
of course, Veer. So look, I think there is agreement with what you just share as an introduction to the question, right? So the explainability part, what you also call transparency, it's not easy to get simply because if you're thinking about the calculation of any form of AI model, it is to this day still called a black box for a reason. Is that it's difficult to reverse engineer the understanding of a specific prediction that comes, for example, from machine learning into what could be basically a more transparent request of some sort. So we do have that. I think it's both a technical limitation in the sense that it is where computation cannot, given the size of the computation, retracted back to a specific decision. And second, this generates a lot of unsettling feelings. And so we are, I think, in the right to request more transparency, but we're kind of colliding a little bit with the limitations of the technology itself. Blockchain as a way of mitigate that is a form of rethinking the structure of information being shared on a decentralized platform hedger, as you want to call it, that give us the access to transparency, not necessarily in terms of the transparency of explainability, which is where the concern of AI really is, but at least on the responsibility that comes from the fact that data that is stored on a blockchain becomes theoretically immutable. And I think this is where the link between responsibility, explainability, ethics feels a little bit more organic in the context of blockchain. And just to add on this, it's not that blockchain will automatically solve the challenges with explainability, but the moment that the transactions are stored, and therefore we are not necessarily going to change that specific order of sequence of transaction that defines the block. It does provide, it's almost like it transpires a sense of responsibility that comes with the fact that the information was stored on a ledger that is not designated for manipulation. So it's mostly about the signal that it sends. It does enhance the security, but as you know, because you study blockchain, blockchain is a form of securization. It securizes the information. That's why it tokenizes them eventually, right? But
Yeah.
it doesn't necessarily answer to the specific question about can I explain this? It does answer to the question about can I build more accepted transparency in how processes are basically unfolding? And I think that's where the blend of the two technologies is important. It doesn't fulfill every single set of concerns, but it's definitely a step forward in comparison to where we currently are with AI, rather than just expecting that there will be blind trust on the developers of this technology just because.
Yeah, absolutely. Blockchain will be a huge step forward, although it obviously won't solve all the answers, but it'll be a huge step forward into having trust in the AI, and so it could grow in the future. So this leads to my second question, which is you've worked extensively with governments, global institutions, and industry leaders, and we often hear about the importance of ethical AI, like I mentioned last question. But aligning these different sectors to actually create effective framework for AI governance can be a challenge.
Yeah,
From your perspective, how can these sectors collaborate more effectively to ensure AI is governed responsibly and in a way that's future ready? Also, from your
yeah.
perspective, which parts of the world are showing the most innovation of leadership in this space?
Yes, so that's a great question. So look, I will try to come up with basically what is the architecture of governance that is required, and then we can look at some examples where this has kind of happened, at least sending positive signals to the expectation that
Yeah.
governments around the world are understanding this. So when we talk about governance of AI from a government perspective, it's mostly about mitigation of risks. In general, governance, it is governing, a specific process or function, not for the sake of governing, but for the sake of risk mitigation. So
Yeah.
the core idea of a government is to make sure that, for example, if you have algorithms in the stock exchange, that the stock exchange doesn't necessarily get completely out of control with spikes that are either too high or too low, that builds enormous amount of volatility for a country, right? That would be one example.
Yeah.
If you're looking at governance that the government wants to see apply to consumers, you want to make sure that consumers have some layer of protection when they're
Mhm.
using technology, that not everybody using technology might be facing a cybercrime of some sort. So it's mostly about mitigation. When you're trying to mitigate, which is I think where governments are currently struggling, there's almost like a subtle balance to strike. And you have to bear in mind that the balance doesn't happen at the same time. So it's mostly about a time game with variables that you do not directly control, but they are important for you. So I'll try to be more specific. So innovation is important. We want organization to try to bring new products and market and services into the market, because that's how basically the economies grow. We are improving the access to services and goods for consumers. We are basically setting up companies that might be startups, and eventually they expand and scale, hiring people who are coming from our universities. We want that additional service to represent an additional form of consumption, so people will eventually buy for this, because we have this assumption that we need to grow for a country to be prosperous. And so, even if you can argue the assumption is limited, but it is an assumption that's been working relatively well for a period of time. Bearing in mind this, when you are allowing private sector to innovate, a lot of these innovations, they operate outside of regulatory framework, because these are technologies that exist in the moment as part of the innovation, but don't have a legal framework that could eventually regulate them. So there's a space which is very, very discretionary, depending on the governments, where you have to fundamentally balance what we call the expediency of innovation. So the fact the innovation happens, and the legality of innovation, or the legal framework. And I'm going to try to make an example for your crowd. So if you remember when, well, you're young, but when Uber was introduced, Uber was a different way of rethinking personal mobility. It
Mhm.
wasn't your car, it was not a taxi, it was not public transportation, it was a hybrid. It was somebody's car that is going to be used for public transportation, right?
Yeah.
And so, well, private transportation in this case, but feel at the price that could be
Mm.
felt as public. There was no legal framework for that. So that could be, for example, the expediency of innovation, a company that brings to the market something that does not exist. Over time, the government had to legalize that to make sure that it wasn't becoming a reckless activities, but it was regulated some sort. Either because you want the Uber drivers to pay taxes, or that you want to have a vetting process that is qualifying drivers to drive Uber, or because you're doing it for insurance purposes. So that's a perfect example of expediency and so like legitimacy, put it this way. The governance we're talking about in your question, it is fundamentally about governments trying to find the balance between the expediency and the legitimacy. And it's not easy, because the pace of development that we have these days are too fast for government to be able to truly understand what to regulate. So that to give you an answer to the
Yeah.
question about the governance of AI from a government perspective. I think there was a question that you also had at the tail of your previous one about
Yeah.
who is doing well, right? In this
Yeah.
case.
Yeah.
So look, it's not that there are countries doing well and countries not doing well, but there are some countries that are showing better understanding of what is at stake. So in, for example, Europe, you see countries, especially in the European Union, that because of the GDPR, which was this general data protection mechanism that the Europeans have set up, have protected consumer from more predatory marketing of data, and he has somehow forced companies to directly disclose, right? That's why sometimes we go on a website and we have to accept the information stored or not, what they call the cookies, right? And so this is an example where this block of countries have done relatively well. You could argue that other countries, let's take the example in the Gulf, where you have in countries like the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, they have stipulated agreements with the technology companies that even if the physical servers of, for example, storage of information, what we call in everyday's language, the clouds, are not in the country, then the data is proprietary to the government, not necessarily to the private company. And that's a form of governance where eventually the government was able to regulate where the data is. When they can go even further, they would ask the server to be physically in a given country, meaning that although it's a cloud, so we understand it is so like a distributed storage, but there's always a physical server somewhere in the world. So they have been able to request that to be in their territory. So not everyone, but I think these are examples of governance of AI that has shown an understanding of mitigation of risk. And then you could argue that um, countries that tend to be smaller in size and therefore they're more exposed, they have been much more proactive in trying to find ways to mitigate the risk. And so you have several AI X, which are basically our AI governance documents that have been basically produced by several countries from Australia, right, to some of the countries in Southeast Asia, to basically even country in the African continent, where there are clear rules of engagement on how we expect the technology to work and how do we protect from the darker side of the technology. So in a nutshell, this is what a governance of AI feels like from a perspective of running this on the ground. It's never a full-fledged governance model that covers against every single risk, but I think is a positive sign that shows government taking this technology more seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. So from what I've seen, you've mentioned this as well already, but tech innovation usually starts in the private sector, but the frameworks that shape its impact are often decided elsewhere, whether it's in policy discussions, international agreements, or even academic research. And when those conversations like don't involve all the right decision makers, things tend to like slip through the cracks. And what's like encouraging to me and like what's impressive to me is like we're seeing regions like the EU with initiatives like with initiatives like the AI Act leading the charge, and even smaller nations too are like stepping up with like national AI strategies that can serve for models that can serve as models for other countries and continents, which is really impressive to me. And also one more thing, for students like us, it's easy to focus on tech
Mhm.
itself, but what's just as important is understanding the system behind the decisions, the thought process behind the decisions. When we
Mhm.
grasp how policy and regulation evolves, we can better prepare ourselves to shape those conversations and ultimately the future of AI governance. So leading into this, I want to focus on to the next generation, students like me and my peers. There's so much conversation around AI and how it's going to reshape everything, our jobs, education, and even our social lives. Sometimes that creates a sense of pressure, like we have to keep, like we have to race to keep up, or we'll fall behind. And so, based on your experience, what should the next generation be thinking about when it comes to AI, and how can we proactively prepare to navigate its risks and opportunities?
Yeah, so your generation is what we will call an AI native generation. So it's a generation that was born when AI was already fully discovered, but not in terms of the historical beginning, but the new versions of AI that started with machine learning, deep learning, right? And therefore largely scaling to become this global phenomenon that we're talking about these days. And so I think the first conversation to say you are an AI native generation, therefore the conversation on AI are much more important than conversation from people that came from the previous wave of technology revolution, right? There was the digital infrastructure. The second conversation that is important to take into account is that there's no inherent trade-off between the incredible power that this technology have and the fact that we need to protect it. And so
Yeah.
building a generation that are more compassionate about the risks makes it simply a more resilient generation. It's not too different from how previous generation have defined, for example, food and how we handle food had to be regulated. Reason why we can't simply have a food truck just because we want to. We need to have a license, right? It's the same reason
Yeah.
why there are generation who thought that when you have a prescription that require medication that the doctor to prescribe, they don't get sold over the counter just because, but you need to go and see a doctor that will do that. So there were mechanism of protection to make sure the consumer could use the benefit of the technology, of the innovation, but with some form of control. Now, they were kind of common sense back in the days, in the sense that although there was some resistance at first, it was kind of inevitable that we would move into the direction of governance. Today, it's much more complex because the cycles of decision making are shorter. And so, my recommendation for your generation is to see the ethical side of AI as inherent to AI. So it's not that you're decoupling it, it's actually, part of it is congenial. And as you're developing solutions, many of you will eventually become entrepreneurs. Many of you will go and study majors at university and colleges where you will be exposed to AI. There's this expectation that AI is not just technology, but there's also social implication, is ethical standards, is oversight. So it's like saying, if the previous, let's say 2 generations ago, they saw this as an add-on, it was improving what they already knew, right? So they couldn't see necessarily this for more than an additional set of technologies making many functions faster, better, whatever it is, right? So it was almost like a booster, right?
Yeah.
Your generation needs to take into account that the complexity of what you have brought up into this podcast, the ethics, the traceability, the responsibility, the storage, should it be on a blockchain, the governance, they are part of the very same conversation, which is complex. So rather than finding shortcuts, we want to have solutions that are much more comprehensive of all of this side of the story. And I think this is where your generation will be making a significant difference from a generation like mine, where they still think in terms of silos, in which you can say, well, if the technology is good, fine, somebody will eventually consider the risk, because we were thinking in terms of verticals. You guys are thinking much more in terms of transversal, and there you are interdisciplinary by design. And so I think this is where your generation has a significant benefit in consideration of the needs we have moving forward, and also in contrast with the previous generations.
Yeah, I really connect with what you said. There's this like narrative out there that AI is either going to be the greatest opportunity or the biggest threat to a person. And I think seeing something as really good or like really bad can actually stop people from getting involved or thinking about it in a deeper way. And what we really need to have like is a mindset of like, this is curious, this is critical, I'm like prepared for this, for the challenge that is coming to me. And for me personally, it's about like asking better questions. Well, not just like how does this tool work, but who built it? What values were embedded in it? And who might be impacted that isn't in this room? So I think more students are starting to care about those deeper issues. And it's just not like we want to be builders of tech, but because we want to be responsible builders. And that's where education, mentorship, and open conversations like this come in place. And they help us realize that we're just not bystanders, but we can actually actively shape it and have an impact. So, Dr. Esposito, thank you very much for the wonderful advice, and thank you very much for joining today. This will be the end of our conversation. Your insights have not only not have like has helped break down such a complex topic, and like giving a roadmap for how young people can engage in this thoughtfully. So thank you very much for joining.
Thanks for having me here. Very happy that you're doing this for your peers, for people that are nonetheless kind of wondering about the very same question that you bring to your guests.
Yeah,
And it's important that this initiative are starting from you rather than starting from people from my age, because I think it's really this organic grassroots awareness that is growing, that is going to build it as a culture rather than something that we learn as just information. So very happy that I was able to contribute to your work. Thanks again for having me.
thank you very much. I appreciate it.